I know, I look a little bit different from when I was 13 or whatever. Yeah. Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to this. I don't want to break any thought or anything. Let you prep. Yep. Just wanted to say hi, Mom.
Yes, thank you for doing that.
right, good morning. It's time for us to begin, and Norm Webb Jr. is with us, and I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll let him have the majority of the time, of course. He and Barbara Jo currently live in Athens, Alabama. He has 3 daughters who are graduates of FC. He also received his AA from here, and he's worked as an evangelist in several congregations in the North Alabama area, including currently at the Elton Church of Christ in Elton, Tennessee. He was vice president of Athens Bible School from 2011 to 2016, and he's also currently working as a financial advisor for Edward Jones Investments. So Norm Webb Jr. now is here to present our lesson.
Well, good morning, and thank you for being here this morning. I appreciate it. You can open your Bibles to Luke chapter 12 if you have them with you. We'll be there in just a moment. It has probably been a spiritual feast for you this week, but I also know, like any multi-course meal, you come to a point in which you get full, and after a week of this, I'm sure that can be the case. It reminds me of a time in which I was preaching in Athens, Alabama, and I was about halfway through my sermon, and there was a little girl that wasn't quite 1 year old in the audience. Her name is Macy Weatherford, and she was doing this. She was waving at me in the middle of my sermon, and I thought that is just absolutely precious. And as I finished the sermon, I kind of found her parents, David and Jules, and I went up to them and I told them, I said, Macy was waving at me in the middle of the lesson. It was just so sweet. And Jules smiled and she said, well, we've been teaching her some sign language. And I said, well, that is really cool. I said, well, what does this mean? And she said, well, she uses it during mealtime. And I said, oh, well, that's really nice. Well, what does this mean? She says, well, it means she's all done. So if about halfway through, I'll understand. I really do get it. Thank you for being here. And thank you to Florida College for the opportunity to be here. If you've taught or preached much, you are bound, I'm sure, to have interruptions to your lesson. Maybe it's a cell phone ringing. Maybe it's a fingernail clipping. Maybe it's someone who is interruptive in some way, a baby crying. I've had someone walk in down the middle of the aisle who was a drug addict begging for money, and most recently I had someone who literally fell out into the middle of the aisle and faked a seizure to attempt to manipulate money out of the congregation. We know she faked it because a Sunday later we found her in another congregation doing the same thing. We've all had our interruptions maybe during our preaching and our teaching, but can you imagine interrupting Jesus? And that is the scene that we find there in Luke chapter 12. Jesus is teaching in the Galilean area, and Luke tells us that there are thousands of people there, that they're stepping on one another. So many people that they're stepping on each other, and Jesus is expounding on some of the greatest heavenly principles a human could hear. He's talking about sincerity of heart. He's talking about your value to the Heavenly Father. He's talking about your loyalty to Him and His loyalty to you. And then suddenly, cutting through the divine message, you hear, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. I don't know where Jesus' sermon might have been going, but he seemingly unfazed preaches one of the greatest lessons, or the greatest lesson, on money and eternity and souls. The scene, I think, paints a microcosm of the world and culture that we live in. I don't think this man came to listen to Jesus that day. I don't think he was really interested in following the Master. I think he came that day because he wanted a solution to his financial affairs, and he thought Jesus could give it to him. I'm sure his mind was consumed with other things, much more important to him at that moment. And money and possessions have a way of doing that. Money and possessions have a way of weaving themselves into almost everything. The buying and selling, the trading of goods for currency, it's just part of life. You can't help it. You'll leave today and you'll go somewhere and you'll have to buy something with money in which you had to earn. And you'll do it again and again and again. It's impossible to escape that. It's part of our life. It's just part of the human economic system since the earliest of time. And maybe that is why Jesus talks so much about it. It's a common theme to everyone, and so it became a common theme in his parables. The parable of the talents and the minas, the treasure in the field, the pearl of great price, the woman who searches her home up and down to find one coin, the indebted servants, all use money to talk about working for the master, valuing the kingdom, understanding forgiveness. Jesus used all of that, money, to help us understand heavenly things. Money was not then, nor is it now, good or bad. It is neutral. But it is a commonality of every human being. It's a part of life. It's almost impossible not to be touched by money. But how does money and possessions dominate the landscape of our lives? It can dominate the landscape of our lives. It can hold our attention of our minds. It can consume our hearts, divide our relationships, even dismantle our faith. We can allow it to do that. Matter of fact, sometimes we can even facilitate it to do that. And much like this man in Luke chapter 12, people, yes, even disciples, fail to absorb the greater spiritual message of Jesus because our hearts are too focused on what is now instead of what is to come. And therefore, we significantly devalue ourselves and the souls around us. I'll tell you, to God, it must be disappointing, maybe even shocking, to see his pinnacle creation, and especially his children, think so little of themselves and be so willing to exchange eternal riches of eternity for the baubles of this world. During the summer, when my father was a boy, the ice cream truck would come out around the neighborhood, and we don't see those very much anymore. But the ice cream truck would come around the neighborhood, and my granddaddy and my dad would walk down to the street, and granddaddy would kneel next to my dad, and he would pull out 2 coins, and he would say, "Do you want to get something with this little bitty dime, or do you want to get something with this great big nickel?" Of course, Dad was 3 or 4 at the time, didn't understand the value of currency, but he understood what was bigger than the other, and he'd say, well, of course I want the nickel. By the way, my grandfather was a gospel preacher for 35 years. But I fear that we can be so deceived in the same way. How often are we easily fooled by the devil's deceptions because we fail to grasp the value of what God has to offer? And sometimes, like this man in Luke chapter 12, we are consumed with our rights and our wants, and more with that than our souls, and the work that God has called us to do. The entitlement mentality of our culture has eroded the principles of hard work and patience and generosity and self-discipline, and we, being on guard against that, need to think more clearly and more eternally than the culture around us. And so there are 2 parables that Jesus provides to us to help us understand the sort of relationship that we are to have with money and eternity in light of our souls. So the first one is found there in Luke chapter 12. And the context really begins in about verse 13. And this man abruptly requests Jesus' intervention as to his personal financial affairs. And it seems that this man's father has passed. And in keeping with the culture, it is very likely he is the elder brother. And the elder brother, therefore, would have had control of the estate. And this man, who's likely the younger, wants his share. And it's interesting to me that Jesus' approval, that he wants Jesus' approval for this. And that really hasn't changed, has it? We want Jesus' approval for our monetary practices. We still want Jesus to stamp his approval on the health and wealth gospel, at least in our culture, that's what we see. We want his approval to be stamped on the social justice agenda. And what we find here is that Jesus makes it crystal clear that he's not going to involve himself in those sorts of things. He will not involve himself with this situation between his man and his brother, but instead addresses this man's main problem, and that is greed. That's why Jesus opens and closes these parables with some heavenly, immutable principles. You'll notice he says there in verse 15, "Beware and be on guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And then he closes the parable by saying, "So is the man who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God." And so sandwiched between these two is a parable that illustrates both of them. Jesus relates here a story about a man who's already rich, and he has a bumper crop. And he has to ask himself the question, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Now, you have to understand that the problem with the rich man here isn't that he's rich. And the problem with the rich man here isn't that he has an abundant harvest. It isn't that he has been successful. That's not the issue. The scriptures reveal numerous wealthy individuals who were considered by God to be faithful. Job was called blameless, and yet he was very wealthy. Abraham was very successful, and yet he was considered a friend of God. And so the idea that wealth is the problem, that's not the problem. The problem is how this man viewed his riches in light of his eternity. The rich man continues his dialogue with himself. And the first person pronouns are abundant, aren't they? You know this parable, but let's look at verse 17 or verse 16. It said, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, 'What shall I do since I have no place to store my crops?' And then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you've prepared?'" I think this manifests two issues here. The first is that he seems to have no one to have this conversation with, only himself. Bailey writes about in his book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, he says, "In the Middle East, village people made decisions about important topics after long discussions with their friend." This guy doesn't seem to have a friend. He has himself. And maybe if he had taken the time to have a conversation with someone with a more objective view and more spiritual view, he might have come to a different decision or maybe a different view. But even worse, he gives no consideration to the one who has blessed him so richly. His relationship with God finds no place in his thinking or in his decisions. How different might this story have been if the rich man had sought God and his guidance? Had he done so, he would have been reminded that God owns everything. Psalm 50 says, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." And Haggai says, "The gold and the silver is mine. Everything belongs to God." You and I know that. We know that intellectually, don't we? Everything belongs to him. He is the creator. We get that intellectually. But that principle, that single realization, completely changes how a person thinks and responds to financial blessings or financial crisis. Even the most mundane decisions are brought to the king's throne room in prayer. "Lord, should I buy this house? Should I buy this car? Should I buy this blouse? Should I buy this pair of socks with your money? Father, someone has broken into your house and stole your stuff. What would you like me to do about that? Someone has run into your car. What do I need to do?" It is that realization that God owns it all and we're just managers, we're just stewards, managing what He has blessed us with, that realization changes everything about how we deal with our possessions. We're just stewards. And when that happens, other heavenly principles become more glaringly obvious. And so simple things like don't spend more than you make and don't increase debt at 19% interest with the Lord's goods begins to mean even more. But second, this rich man failed to properly weigh the value of his eternal relationship with God. God says, "You fool. This night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Your stuff is going to go to somebody else." Solomon talked about that in Ecclesiastes. He said in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, "The vanity of a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill only to have it to be given to someone else, it's all vain." Your soul or your goods are going to someone else. They're just on loan. It's all going to be burned up anyway. But your soul, he says, is mine. His soul was required of him. Why? Because he misused it. We think so little of our souls sometimes. Matter of fact, even how we think about that is incorrect. We are first and foremost spirit. We are spirit. We are not given a soul, we are soul. And it belongs to God. The rich man had no treasure laid up in heaven. He was spiritually bankrupt, but he believed that his earthly value could somehow fill this vacuum. As one leaves the structure of this parable, he realizes that Jesus' audience is not the wealthy of society. And sometimes that's the way we think about it, is that these things really only apply to the wealthy. The problem of covetousness and greed, it only applies to the wealthy. No, it applies to us all. But as you look here, what's interesting is that Jesus' audience is not necessarily the wealthy. The wealthy really don't worry about where their next meal will come from or will they have enough clothes to stay warm. And one comes to realize that greed and anxiety over accumulation of wealth and possessions is not just a problem for the rich, it's a problem for the poor as well. And so, in summary, Jesus really goes on after this parable and says, look, you need to put your confidence in God, not in your material possessions. He talks to his audience and he says, don't worry about what you will eat or what you will drink or what you will wear. I'll tell you, in 21st century America, do we really worry about that? I don't really worry about whether I'm going to have a meal later today. I might worry about what restaurant I'm going to. Will it be McDonald's or will it be Burns? I don't really worry about what I'm going to wear or if I'm going to have something to wear, but what's the label on it? I tell you, that mindset can infiltrate all the way down to the youngest of us. I remember when I was in high school, I think like most kids, I wanted a nice car when I was in high school. I wanted a red Camaro. I drove a 1972 blue Datsun, bluish rust-colored Datsun pickup. It had holes in the floorboard. I could see the road underneath me as I drove. It had a hole in the muffler, so it sounded like it had a Hemi engine in it when it really just had a weak four-cylinder. And when it got to 60 miles an hour, it shook like this. But I'll tell you what, I'd let that impact me because I saw my friends in the cars they were driving, and I thought less of myself. I thought less of my family. It infiltrates us, how we think about these things. And Jesus says, your confidence needs to be put in the Lord. Because one day your soul will be required of you. And it's not going to matter what you accumulated here. What's going to matter is where your treasure is in heaven. Focus your heart on eternal treasures. Now, we could talk a lot more about that, but let's go over to Luke chapter 16. Because if God owns it all, and if our soul is going to be required of us, and if you're supposed to be focused on eternal treasure, the question then becomes, what do we do with the blessing that God has given us? The parable of the unrighteous steward in Luke chapter 16 helps us to answer that question. And I will admit to you that this is challenging to interpret. For starters, how is it possible to build any kind of positive spiritual principles on the unethical actions of an unrighteous steward? Can any good teaching come from this patently bad example of this individual? But I think that's maybe what makes Jesus the master teacher. The turn of his stories are often shocking and cuttingly capture not just the attention of his hearers, not just our attention, but it exposes our weaknesses as well. How we think and how we live. There are a lot of views about this unjust manager. And I will tell you that when David sent me the email and told me that this is what he wanted me to cover, I said, "You are really desperate." And I'm not going to tell you that I've got all the answers. But I will say that the very view all seems to point to one concept. Do you have as much ingenuity and passion and deliberate decision-making about your eternal future as this man did about his earthly future? Are we as resourceful regarding our earthly possessions in light of eternity as this man was, as the ungodly person would be about their earthly future? Let's get this parable in front of us and spend a little time with it. He says in Luke chapter 16, verse 1, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager." The manager said to him, "What shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." And he summoned each one of his master's debtors and began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so when it fails, they will receive you into their eternal dwellings. He who is faithful in a little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you've not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you've not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for you either hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. We have a manager that it seems at one time held the confidence of his master, of his employer. And often the manager would live on the grounds of the area or land or even of the master in which he was doing his work for. And he was highly trusted to the point where the employer hardly knew sometimes even what was going on. Sometimes he was even considered part of the family. And the master simply trusted the manager to run the business. But now it's been reported that he has squandered the employer's possessions. That's an interesting term, squander the employer's possessions. I'll just make this quick note. It sounds very much like a prodigal son who has squandered his father's possessions. But he has squandered his master's possessions. And that's been reported. He's cooked the books, laundered the money, stole from the employer, and the employer fires him, or at least demotes him, and requires an audit of the books. The manager's reputation will be ruined, and he quickly recognizes his situation, that he is in, and he needs to make sure that his manner of living is going to be secure after this. If he doesn't secure the favor of other employers, he knows that he's either going to be digging ditches because he's found no other job to do, or he's going to have to beg, which he would have been ashamed. So he has a eureka moment. I think maybe if this was on television, you would see the light bulb come above his head. I know what I'll do. In order to secure a place to stay, to be welcomed in by others, to house me and take care of me, I'll cut the payment. I'll cut the debt that they have. This is where the parable becomes challenging. And however one interprets it, the story has to fit Jesus' commentary. I think that's the important thing here. How were this man's actions shrewd? More shrewd than the actions of the sons of light. How does it fit into the sons of light using unrighteous mammon in order to be received into eternal dwellings? And how does it relate to being faithful in little things so that one day we might receive greater things? And ultimately, how does the principle of being loyal to one master flow out of this? That's the challenge that we're faced with here. I want to provide for you maybe a couple suggestions on how this might be seen. Some might suggest that the manager here lowers the debt of those leasing the land by cutting his commission. Managers were usually left by their employers to determine what lease payments would be. Their job was to make sure there was a profit that was to be made, make sure that the one leasing the land would continue to lease the land, that is, retain the client. Make sure that the profit margins were reasonable enough where the employer made something and as well as it wasn't overpriced, and yet at the same time the manager got cut as well. And it's very possible that this manager is charging as much as 20 to 50% higher than really what is necessary. And so he sacrifices his own wage here, lowers the debt significantly, and wins the graces of those farming the land. That's a possibility. It even happens today. And in such an interpretation like this, we see this man making a sacrifice. That is, to see his long-term gain, he makes the short-term forfeiture of what he would have received. And we almost see maybe an attitude of repentance. And by doing so, he would be welcomed in the homes of those that he helped. By cutting their debt, removing that, they would be indebted to him. That's one interpretation. A second interpretation might be that we actually see no change in this man's character. That just as he was cheating his employer before, he continues to do that. And so instead now he takes it to the next level and goes to all the land leasers, and I think only 2 are listed here. There might have been a lot others. But he goes to all the land leasers and significantly cuts the lease by establishing a new contract, a new debt of certificate that they sign off on, and eliminates any profit that might be brought to the employer. It is a ruthless move that sticks it to the employer that fired him. That's possible. Jesus gives commentary on this. He relates the business dealings of the manager to the sons of the world. He is contrasting this term, sons of the world, to sons of light. And so the sons of the world would be those who have worldly values and worldly, unscrupulous business dealings. These types of people do whatever it takes to make money or save their own skin. It doesn't matter who gets hurt or who loses their shirt or who goes to jail, just as long as it's not them. Solomon even talks about that in Proverbs, and he says the wicked lay at night scheming about what wickedness they could do. And this very much might be the case. This man is shrewd, whatever it takes. And I think Jesus' comment might be that if they were not so absolutely crooked, that the sons of the world's resourcefulness and creativity and determination and passion and diligence and hard work might even be admirable. And maybe that is what Jesus is doing here. What if the sons of light, what if you and I gave that much thinking, that much effort, that much diligence, that much hard work to how we manage our personal resources in this world in light of the eternal world with God and His people to come? What if we gave that much effort, as the sons of the world do, to making money and saving their own skin for later in this life? That if they gave that much effort, knowing that it's still going to end in death, what if we gave that kind of effort toward managing our possessions in light of the eternity to come? I will tell you, as a financial advisor, I do spend a lot of time talking to people about their wealth, and we spend a lot of time strategizing about how they're going to make money and how they're going to avoid taxes. What if we gave that much effort in light of our souls in managing our money? Money is a tool that in evil or ignorant hands can do great harm, or in wise and knowledgeable hands can do great good. The term unrighteous mammon here that Jesus uses throws us a little bit in Jesus' commentary. And it does make it challenging sometimes to interpret and make sense of. On the surface, it gives the impression of wealth that was attained corruptly. But I don't think that's what Jesus means when he says unrighteous mammon. Mammon is a transliteration of the same Aramaic word, and it was associated with a Syrian idol or a Syrian god. And sometimes it even meant one in which one puts one's trust. And so Jesus' use of this word does not indicate that money of itself was evil. He's not indicating maybe of wealth that was come about by unscrupulous means, but rather he's simply using this term to indicate that the money itself was unreliable. It was short-term in this world. It's part of a system that will one day be burned up, as Peter aptly puts it in 2 Peter chapter 3. And I think this is what Jesus means when he says later on, he says that it will fail. When he says in verse 9, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of the unrighteous, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings. Because everything in this world does fail. Money fails. You think about that. While money can buy a lot of things in this world, there's a lot it cannot do. The rich and the poor still get sick and get old. They still lose loved ones. The rich and the poor still struggle with depression. The rich and the poor still struggle with relationship problems and mental disease and cancer and a host of other earthly problems. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you're going to have them. And I'll tell you one thing riches doesn't do, it doesn't avoid death. It fails. The unrighteous wealth, the unrighteous mammon, money fails. That's why we saw in the last parable, Jesus says, don't put your confidence in it. So Jesus says, use this unrighteous mammon to make friends so will they receive you into eternal dwellings. And that becomes the other question we have here. What does that mean? Do I get to buy my way into heaven? Is that how that works? Well, I think every one of us knows that's not the case. But I think this is where Jesus gets personal. Instead of using your earthly wealth selfishly to pursue your own pleasure, to fulfill all your own desires, Jesus says, use it to make eternal investments. It's the principle he gives in Matthew chapter 6. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but rather lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where moth and rust does not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. He says you need to be using what you have here to make investments in such a way where you will be received into heavenly dwellings. How do we do that? What heavenly treasures is he referencing? Who is welcoming us into these eternal dwellings? Well, I think that's where we make the application. Money is a resource to be used for the good of others. We live to serve even with our money. Jesus says, use your money to make friends. Not earthly friends, not earth-bound friends, but friends who will welcome you into eternal dwellings. I'll tell you, I think when we think of heaven, we think about who will be there. And I think a lot of times what comes to mind is we think about loved ones, we think about friends, we think about family, we think about who we'll see when we get there. But I think Jesus takes us into a different direction. In Matthew 25, he talks about those who were on the left and on the right. And he says those who are on the right enter in to your heavenly home, because when I was sick, you cared for me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was in prison, you visited me. And they said, when did we do these things? And he says, when you did it to the smallest one of mine, you did it to me. You eased the pain of poverty. You salved sickness or helped one persevere through persecution. You fed the hungry. So that maybe it closed the door that Satan might have used to capture a mind or a heart or a soul. And I'll tell you, when viewed this way, it makes sense that right after this parable, he chastises the Pharisees because it says they loved money and they scoffed at the things that he says. And right after that, he gives the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Guess who Lazarus did not welcome into eternal dwellings? Lazarus sat at his doorstep day after day after day, and that rich man could have done something about it, and he did nothing. And Jesus says, Lazarus went to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man was in torment. How much different would that story have been? Could you have pictured the scene where Lazarus welcomes in the rich man because of the opportunities the rich man would have taken to help him? Paul warns about such things. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, he talks to those who are concerned about these things. He says, but godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment, for we brought nothing into the world, so we can take nothing out of it either. If we have food and covering with these, we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And he makes that warning. And then he says in verse 17, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Paul gives the commentary on what Jesus says here in Luke 16. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28, he says, you're going to put off the old man, you're going to put on the new. He says, stop stealing and instead work with your hands so you can have lots of great stuff. No, he says, so you can share with others. Maybe you've heard the story of the man whom God, fictitious story of course, the man whom God offered to take to heaven and to hell to let him see the two. And he takes the man to hell, and there are the condemned, and it's the scene of which they're all sitting around this big bowl of stew. And all of the condemned are there, and they are gaunt, and they are thin, and they are grossly emaciated. And they're holding these long spoons that reach into the stew, but they cannot feed themselves because the spoon is so long they can't bring it to their mouth. And then God takes him to heaven, and it's the same scene. the big bowl of stew, the long spoons. Everybody's sitting around, except now all those in heaven that are dwelling there are full, and they're bright, and their eyes are bright, and their faces are rosy, and they're healthy. And the man says, "What is the difference?" And God says, "These in heaven have learned to feed each other." As the unjust steward was liberal with his master's money in an unethical way, and it won him friends, Jesus is reminding us that we are stewards as well. But we have the Lord's permission. No, we have the Lord's express orders to be generous with the master's resources in order to make friends for eternity. We have brethren all over this world and even in this country that can use our help. But let me take that a step further. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul talks about the fellowship that the Philippians had with those in Philippi in his preaching of the gospel. He says in Philippians chapter 1, "I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all, in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now." And he'll talk about at the end of this letter about they and they alone supported him in the preaching of the gospel. Can you imagine your money going towards supporting others to preach the gospel around the world? And souls that you never met on that eternal day standing on the edge of glory and welcoming you in because it was through your resources that you helped send someone to somewhere and they heard the gospel and you had a part in that. Jesus is telling us here in Luke chapter 16, the shrewdness that the world has with their possessions and making sure that they're taken care of in the future is the same shrewdness, the same creativity, the same determination that you and I need to have in dealing with our possessions here. Use what God has given you to do what you can wherever you are. Jesus talks here about being faithful in a very little thing and us being given responsibility of greater riches later. And sometimes we want to say, well, if I had more money, I might do more. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul is appealing to the Corinthians to complete the work in which they had begun in supporting those who were in Jerusalem. And he says that they gave liberally out of their poverty. And they did that by giving themselves to the Lord first and then gave their possessions. What we do with our money reveals the true state of our heart. Have we traded eternal riches for ourselves and others, for the trinkets and trifles and luxuries and status symbols of this world? God uses a different currency from a different bank. In close, I want to invite you to go over to Revelation 14 for just a moment. Revelation 14. And there is this scene in Revelation where we see that the saved are standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb. And what we find in verse 13, he says, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, yes, as the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them.'" He says those who stand on Mount Zion with the Lamb will be those whose works follow with them. Not your possessions, not your money, not your status symbol, not anything you've accumulated in this world, but what's going to follow you to eternity is what you've done. The currency of heaven will be the blood of Jesus that motivates one to put his focus on living morally, speaking with integrity, pressing on patiently, and keeping God's commands faithfully. He rests from his labors because he has died in the Lord. His heart is in heaven because he has treasured his relationship with God more than his relationship with his material possessions. The dangers of riches is not having them or owning them. The danger of riches is them having you and owning you instead of you being owned by the Lord. What will we do with what we have here? It's so little compared to what we will receive. How hard are we working to make sure that our money and possessions is used in such a way to bring glory to the Heavenly Father and good to others? How determined are we with that? When I was a boy, when I was growing up, I wanted a glove, a baseball glove that was signed by Johnny Bench. When I got to be 10 years old, I wanted a 10-speed bicycle, like my good friend Jack Muzio. When I was 16, I've already told you what I wanted then, right? That red Camaro. I'm now 48. I work full-time in one job, and I preach at another. I've got 3 kids, still paying off Florida college loans. All I want now is a nap. And God has promised that. He's promised that rest. But we've got work to do now. And our money is part of that. Will we have the determination, the shrewdness to be faithful in these little things? So one day, we will receive so much more. Thank you for your good attention.